See that family over there? Watch me get 'em with a pair. Blood and guts just everywhere. Napalm sticks to kids.
Napalm. Even the word conjures images of horrific burns and injuries and the Vietnam War. No other weapon is so tied to a particular conflict, whilst being ingrained into our understanding of the horrors of war. Images of heavily burned survivors of napalm and black smoke rising amongst the forest are easily brought to mind. But napalm's history is much more than just Vietnam, and in today's video, we will cover just how it was developed, its destructive application, and how such weapons were eventually limited. Napalm is an incendiary weapon, a mixture of petroleum and gelling agents. The word napalm is a mixture of the chemical names of the early gelling agents, naphthalene and palmitate. It was developed during the Second World War by a Harvard professor named Louis Feiser, a well-liked lecturer who was secretly part of the National Defense Research Committee. Feiser was a gifted organic chemist and turned his skills to developing explosives for the war effort. His research led him to discover the usefulness of, quote, a bomb that would scatter large burning blobs of sticky gel. The result was a 70-pound napalm bomb that was successfully tested in a Harvard playing field. Napalm first saw its use during the Second World War. It was used in the bombing of Berlin, but saw more use in the Pacific Theatre. It was often used as fuel for flamethrowers to burn out enemy pillboxes and defense positions. Often, those killed by napalm flamethrowers in enclosed spaces died not from the burns, but from carbon monoxide poisoning. The burning of napalm would often use oxygen in the air and give off carbon monoxide. Where Japanese soldiers had dug in and refused to surrender, napalm proved an effective if horrendous weapon. Napalm bombs played a major role in the firebombing of Tokyo in 1945, in what was known as Operation Meeting House. Fueled by largely wooden structures, the subsequent firestorms claimed the lives of around 100,000 civilians, making it the deadliest air raid in human history. In the years after World War II, napalm was used in a number of conflicts. From the Greek Civil War to the Korean War, many countries used napalm. It was deployed by the French in Vietnam in the First Indochina War. Here, napalm saw much use. The Rhodesian Air Force used napalm, and so too did the French in the Algerian War. Its use often resulted in civilian casualties, many of whom left with life-changing injuries. One of the defining characteristics of napalm is the sticky burning gel. It burns at around 1000 degrees Celsius and can burn for a prolonged period of time. This makes napalm effective at ensuring buildings will be set ablaze, but when a person is exposed to napalm, the intense heat or blast is often enough to kill. If the napalm gel lands on a person, it will quickly burn through any clothes and sink into the skin. It will cause deep burns as the gel eats into the flesh, and if severe enough, can cause multiple organ failure. For those who survive, they will be left with scarred skin and damaged muscles. Once burning, it is incredibly difficult to put out the fire, save by smothering the burning gel, which can risk in spreading the napalm even further. It will be through multiple skin grafts and surgeries that a survivor of napalm can hope to recover, a long and expensive process not available to all. To be exposed to napalm has been described as a torture by combining the horrors of chemical asphyxiation with intense burns. Exposure to napalm was a horror beyond comprehension. It was during the Vietnam War that napalm saw its greatest use, as well as much media exposure to its deployment. It was used to burn out Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces hiding in bunkers, foxholes, and tunnels. Bombers dropped around 352,000 tons of napalm during the conflict. Along Vietnam's rivers, riverboats mounted with napalm flamethrowers, nicknamed Zippos, were used to destroy tunnels and bunkers along the shore. By this time, the recipe for napalm had changed to using polystyrene mixed with petroleum, making it much cheaper to produce. This only helped in making the use of napalm more widespread, cementing its status as synonymous with the Vietnam War. Many people, including children, fell victim to napalm, with those who survived left with horrific injuries. There is no doubt as to the most famous survivor of napalm, that being Kim Phuc. The Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph of 9-year-old Kim screaming in pain as her back burned became the defining image of the Vietnam War. We do have a specific and separate video on Kim's story for those who are interested, but as a point to show the damage napalm can inflict, we will leave you with one truly disturbing fact. Kim underwent dozens of operations to help manage her injuries. Her last surgery was in 2022, some 50 years after being burned with the napalm. The napalm severely damaged her nerve endings, leaving Kim in agony as they could misfire. That's not to say anything about the psychological impact of being subjected to a worldwide famous photo in a vulnerable and painful situation. Such was the damage inflicted, Kim has required surgeries throughout her life. Despite this, Kim has spent her life helping children who have survived the horrors of war. As the world saw what was happening in Vietnam, the use of napalm became a vocal point for the anti-war movement. The company Dow Chemicals, the maker of napalm, was targeted by boycotts and demonstrations. Dow Chemicals also made other products such as Agent Orange, which is a carcinogenic defoliant that causes horrendous birth defects, and Saran Wrap. At university campuses, students would kick out Dow Chemical recruiters, refusing to work for a company that produced such weapons. Louis Pfizer, although not regretting creating the weapon, did have his own concerns about the deployment of napalm. He insisted he envisioned the weapon used only against wooden structures, not against people. Pfizer would later admit his role in developing napalm from his autobiography, distancing himself from his most infamous creation. He would also attempt to distance himself from the application of napalm, stating the inventor of the rifle is not responsible if it is used to assassinate a president. To this day, napalm and other incendiary weapons are not prohibited against military targets. Rather, there is a ban against using napalm against civilian targets and areas with concentrations of civilians. The UN Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons of 1980 imposed this restriction, which would make tactics as area firebombing as seen in Tokyo prohibited under international law. Whilst many countries abandoned napalm in favour of other incendiary weapons like white phosphorus, it has reportedly been used in recent times. Argentina had stockpiles of napalm and attempted to use napalm against British paratroopers on 2 occasions, though it did not ignite. There were reports of napalm barrel bombs deployed during the Syrian civil war, both against Kurdish fighters and against civilians. Whilst the use of incendiaries has declined due to international law, they can still be used against military targets, with allowances for civilian casualties where all feasible precautions are made to avoid them. Napalm is not only a weapon of great destructive power, but also one that has permeated into popular culture. The famous quote, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning, it smells like victory," from the film Apocalypse Now captures public perception of its use in Vietnam, and the perception that the United States military saw escalating violence to attempt to win. The disturbingly glib military song, "Napalm Sticks to Kids," is an example of how soldiers themselves saw the use of napalm, as well as the wider horror and dehumanization in the Vietnam War. The marching style song sang in a military cadence was reportedly written using individual soldiers' experiences of the war. Snippets of this song have been used in the beginning and end of the video. Due to the prevalence of Vietnam War movies, napalm in turn became part of cinema as a weapon closely associated to the conflict. The use of napalm has thankfully declined, though its legacy will remain. The impact of firebombing during the Second World War and its wide use during the Vietnam War will cement napalm as one of the more destructive weapons of the 20th century.
18 kids in a no-fire zone, books under arms and going home. Last in line goes home alone. Napalm sticks to kids.
During the Vietnam War, the forces fighting for the South Vietnamese were beset by the guerrilla tactics of the North Viet Cong. The Viet Cong would employ all manner of booby traps, surprise attacks, and ingenious weapons to combat the technological superiority of their enemy. Very often the Viet Cong would retreat, rest, and plan their attacks from a labyrinth of underground tunnels and bases. The job given to enter these tunnels and flush out the Viet Cong was arguably one of the more terrifying and dangerous jobs of the war, and those brave enough to venture into the underground mazes were called tunnel rats. In today's video, we will cover just what these underground tunnels were like, the men who entered them, and what it would be like fighting in such a claustrophobic environment. Whilst the tunnels played a major role during the Vietnam War, they had been used for quite some time before. During the First Indochina War, or Anti-French Resistance War, the communist forces of the Viet Minh dug a series of tunnels. This process began towards the end of the 1940s, with the tunnels used to connect communities and to allow for guerrilla combat against the French colonial forces. But lessons were learned, and following the start of the Vietnam War, these tunnels were expanded. In the early 1960s, the Viet Cong communist forces would expand the tunnels and make great use of them against their enemies. During the war, the tunnels of the Cu Chi covered a distance of over 150 miles, connecting bases from Saigon to the Cambodian border. The tunnels would prove to be the best way to hide from the American forces, who would employ defoliation and aerial reconnaissance to root out the Viet Cong forces who would melt back into the jungles. The tunnels would range in complexity, from simple burrows to vast specialized rooms, wells, and storage facilities. The tunnels would have hidden entrances both in the jungles and in the villages friendly to the Viet Cong. These entrances would be incredibly small and designed to avoid detection. Hospitals, barracks, and weapons factories would be built underground. Some of the rooms would have electricity, but often the only light would be from candles or handheld flashlights. The tunnels linking such rooms would weave through the underground, some having dead ends, hidden traps, and all manner of wildlife to make them dangerous places to those who did not know the layout. The elevation and size of the tunnels would often change, adding further to the difficulty. The tunnels were built too deep to be affected by even the heaviest of bombings. Attempts to use gas or water to flood out the tunnel would prove to be ineffective, as they were designed to counteract attempts with special ventilation rooms and tunnels designed to mitigate flooding. It was into this warren that combat engineers, nicknamed tunnel rats, would attempt to disrupt the Viet Cong's tactics. Some of the first tunnel rats would be from the Australian military, but the practice was soon spread amongst the rest of the Allied forces in Vietnam. When the tunnel rats were tasked with entering the underground bases, they engaged in a form of warfare that was far from conventional. Those who went into the tunnels would volunteer, meaning it would be those brave enough to spend hours in the claustrophobic darkness, unaware of any enemies lurking in the shadows. Whilst tunnel rats were famed for their underground exploits, their primary role would be as combat engineers. They would be responsible for locating and disarming all manner of mines and traps that would be planted. It would be common for the Viet Cong to launch diversionary attacks on a military base so that others could lay anti-tank and anti-personnel mines. Many more would be planted on approaches to villages or suspected helicopter landing zones. Arguably the most infamous of the mines used was the M16, otherwise known as the jumping jack. The device, once triggered, springs up into the air and detonates around the waist. Casualties from this device would be catastrophic, each potentially causing dozens of casualties. Much of their time would be spent dealing with these devices above ground, whilst hoping to destroy caches of weapons and limiting their deployment with actions below ground. A link will be pinned in the comments to the accounts of Jim Marrett, a combat engineer and tunnel rat who served with the Australian Engineering Corps. According to his account, the role was incredibly dangerous, highlighted by the 33% casualty rate suffered by his unit. And whilst many would die in the tunnels, many more would die above ground attempting to disarm mines and save their comrades. But it would be in the tunnels that a different level of danger would present itself. Due to the confined spaces, the men would be armed with pistols, revolvers, knives, and explosives to destroy any weapon caches that they might come across. But even with handguns, firing in such a confined space could be deafening. Smaller caliber weapons with suppressors were favoured, as they would produce a smaller muzzle flash. There are, however, the odd instance of tunnel rats using shotguns in the confined spaces. When travelling through the tunnels, the men had to be aware of any traps that might litter the way. One of the more common traps would be holes dug in the tunnels, with a fake floor hiding dozens of sharpened punji sticks. Very often these sticks would be coated in poison, venom, or human feces, as to doom the victim to a deadly infection. Other dangers could include false walls where the Viet Cong soldiers could lie in wait to ambush the unaware. Some traps even involved dropping insects, scorpions, or snakes, just adding to the terror and danger. And whilst the tunnels were generally well made, there was always a risk of collapse and being buried alive. Perhaps most disturbing of all was that some rooms would store the Viet Cong dead, left to rot and obscure the casualties inflicted. The rewards for braving such conditions could be great. Uncovering and destroying a cache of mines could save the lives of their friends, and would mean they would have to deal with less mines above ground. All manner of intelligence could be recovered as well, as high-ranking Viet Cong commanders could be captured for interrogation. In 1966, Operation Crimp was launched in the Cu Chi region, which uncovered the extensive network of tunnels. A combined American and Australian force sought to clear the tunnels. Whilst plenty of the Viet Cong supplies were captured and destroyed, they were not able to clear out all of the tunnels successfully. The Cu Chi tunnels would go on to play a major role in the Tet Offensive, where the Viet Cong launched a massive surprise attack on the American and South Vietnamese soldiers. Their tunnels were vital in allowing the Viet Cong soldiers to move undetected, getting in position without giving away their upcoming attacks. It would not be until 1970 that American B-52 bombers dropped a huge number of delayed fuse bombs. These bombs would bury deeper into the ground before detonating, rendering the tunnels at least partly unusable. But even to this day, you can visit the Cu Chi tunnels as a tourist attraction, and see how you might fit inside such a space. But remember, the tunnels were actually made bigger for the tourists, so the real tunnels would have been a lot smaller. From 1965 to 1972, around 700 tunnel rats were deployed. In that time, 36 were killed and 200 were wounded. The role of the tunnel rat is arguably the most disturbing role one could undertake during the Vietnam War. Having to fight alone in such a confined space would have been a daunting task. Warfare is traumatic enough without adding to it the close proximity and claustrophobic terror of fighting underground. The photograph known as Napalm Girl is one that is synonymous with the Vietnam War. The use of napalm as a weapon was used widely during the conflict, with this photograph showing the horrific effects. The young girl, Phan Thi Kim Phuc, is in the centre of the photograph, having removed her napalm-covered clothes. But what is the story behind such a famous photograph? Kim Phuc was only 9 years old when the photograph was taken. She and her family lived in the town of Trang Bang. By 1972, America's role in supporting the South Vietnamese against the Communist North had been going on for decades. From 1966, it was believed by the American military that any victory in Vietnam was not possible. Yet, the war continued. In June of 1972, the North Vietnamese army captured the town of Trang Bang. Many of the civilian population fled to a nearby Buddhist temple to hide from the fighting. Kim Phuc and her family were amongst them. The South Vietnamese Army and Air Force engaged the North Vietnamese. Both forces initially kept clear of the temple, though by the second day of fighting, this was no longer the case. Airstrikes were carried out at designated points, as marked by coloured smoke, by the ground forces. Napalm bombs were being used with conventional bombs. For those that are unaware, napalm is a type of firebomb. It is a gel-like mixture that burns as hot as 1000 degrees Celsius and is designed to stick to a surface, whether it be metal, concrete, or human skin. Although it was developed during World War II, it is a weapon synonymous with the Vietnam War. It saw widespread use where it was employed to destroy the jungles in which the Viet Cong hid. With the fighting becoming ever closer to the temple, those inside decided to flee. A small group of people, including Kim Phuc, fled the temple, making their way towards the South Vietnamese forces. Just as the group fled, they were spotted by South Vietnamese planes from an ongoing airstrike. The group was mistakenly seen as North Vietnamese troops launching an attack. Kim Phuc happened to be towards the front of the group as the plane dropped its bombs, so she managed to survive. But 2 of her cousins behind her were killed, along with 2 other villagers. However, her back was covered in napalm, burning through her clothes. As Kim Phuc ran down the road, she removed her burning clothes, attempting to reach the South Vietnamese forces with a group of other children who had survived the bombing. Nick Ut, an Associated Press photographer, was amongst the South Vietnamese soldiers and captured photographs of Kim Phuc running towards him. Kim Phuc recalls upon reaching the soldiers, they began feeling her back burn and screaming that it was too hot, too hot. She was taken to a hospital in Saigon by Nick, where the vast 3rd-degree burns on her back were deemed to be fatal, but after 14 months and 17 operations, she was able to return home. But it would not be until 1982 and further operations in Germany that she was able to regain some mobility. Despite this, the injury was long-lasting. Damaged nerve endings left Kim Phuc in agony as they would often misfire. Even decades later, she still needs operations to deal with the injuries. The Associated Press initially refused to accept the photograph as it displayed nudity, but once accepted, it was quickly awarded the Pulitzer Prize. The reaction of President Richard Nixon upon seeing the photograph was initially suspicion. He believed that the photo was staged in a bid to humiliate the American involvement for the war that had failed. When Kim Phuc was 11 years old, she was able to return home. When she did, she was presented with the infamous photograph by her father. Nick Ut had visited her home and presented a copy to her father. She recalls the embarrassment of being naked around her family members, singled out as the only one without clothes. Dealing with the psychological impact of the photograph on top of the physical trauma is something that no one should have to deal with. On top of all this, Kim Phuc was used by the North Vietnamese government as a propaganda piece showing the horrors of war. She was made to give countless interviews and pose for yet more photographs. It was only in 1986 she was able to study in Cuba. It was there where she met Boy Ho Ton, who she would go on to marry in 1992. On return from Moscow for their honeymoon, the flight stopped in Canada. It was there where the couple applied for asylum, which was granted. In Canada, Kim Phuc built a family and attempted to turn the negative of the photograph into a positive. She established the Kim Foundation International, a charitable organisation to help the child victims of war. She travels around the world, giving speeches on forgiveness, on healing, and on letting go of hate. A link to the foundation's website will be found in the description. She is still to this day in touch with Nick Ut. Very often when looking into human conflict, it is easy to forget the civilian casualties. At best, the people in the wrong place at the wrong time. or at worst, those deliberately murdered. The photograph of Napalm Girl is one that reminds us of such horrors. Very often it is just accepted that civilians will die or be injured in the course of war, labelled as collateral damage or other such euphemisms. Perhaps Nixon's initial reaction of disbelief lays bare to the lack of understanding of war by those who decide that the war is worth waging, unable to comprehend the suffering that is inflicted. Or perhaps it shows a callous or deluded nature of a man who could not believe such suffering was possible. Either way, it is Kim Phuc's resolve in the face of such suffering that we should remember. Although the burden of such a photograph should never have been placed on such a young person, Kim Phuc has been able to rise above the horrific injuries and events of her childhood, and I would argue that the world is in a better place for her being able to do so. During the Vietnam War, the United States Armed Forces would deploy a chemical agent that would result in devastating consequences. The goal was to rob the North Vietnamese forces of the benefits of the jungle, which aided them and could massively hinder the Americans. In 1962, it was decided that a defoliation campaign would begin, spraying vast quantities of chemical defoliants. In total, almost 20 million gallons over the course of the war. The most infamous and most used of such chemicals deployed was Agent Orange. Exposure to this chemical can result in a person developing cancers, Parkinson's disease, and can result in their children being born with birth defects. In today's video, we will cover the story of perhaps the most controversial weapon employed during the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, American and South Vietnamese forces were beset by the North Vietnamese tactics. The North's guerrilla tactics relied heavily on the jungle environment. Booby traps hidden amongst the debris of the jungle took a heavy toll on troops and morale. The guerrilla forces would melt back into the jungle, able to re-emerge and ambush at a given moment. The North relied on the materials of the mangroves, rice fields, and the jungles for their building materials, food, and their mode of war. All the while, American forces struggled with leveraging their air superiority and all manner of jungle-borne diseases and infections. In 1962, the United States President John F. Kennedy greenlit Operation Farmhand, the American defoliation program, following a request to defoliate from South Vietnamese President Diem. The Americans took inspiration from similar operations carried out by the British Empire during the Malayan Emergency, where Agent Orange was used to defoliate the jungles used by the Malayan National Liberation Army. Although chemicals were used, it was decided that defoliation by hand was cheaper and more effective at the time. JFK was able to argue there was a precedent of using such defoliants as a result of the British action in Malaya. It was decided to utilize modified C-123 provider planes to spray vast quantities of defoliants over the rice paddies and jungles of Vietnam, robbing the North of their vital cover and food supply. The planes would need to fly at a low speed and at a low altitude to deliver the payload. Planes would fly in formations for a few at a time, each capable of spraying around 250 feet wide and would carry enough Agent Orange to spray for 10 miles. Thousands of missions were flown during the conflict. In addition to the spraying planes, soldiers would spray Agent Orange by hand. This was usually done near military bases to reduce the cover and increase visibility, reducing the risk of an ambush. A number of chemical defoliants were produced and deployed. Agents deployed were known as the rainbow herbicides, each named after a colour. But by far, the most infamous was Agent Orange, which would replace a number of other defoliants due to its effectiveness. Agent Orange was a 50-50 mix of two herbicides, and over the course of the war, around 17 million gallons was sprayed. The mix was such that it was over 50 times the concentration of normal agricultural use. Agent Orange, when applied, would dry out the vegetation and make it so it was not possible for much of the jungle to grow back for around 6 months. But the real danger of Agent Orange was its byproduct. a chemical called tetrachlorodibenzo-p-dioxin, otherwise known as TCDD, a dangerous pollutant often formed as a product following the burning of organic material. This TCDD is only oil-soluble, meaning the dioxin will remain in the soil without being washed away by the rain. It is exposure to TCDD following the use of Agent Orange that causes the horrendous side effects in humans. In the human body, TCDD can remain for as long as 20 years before it is broken down. It has been linked to many forms of cancer, notably prostate and lung, as well as Parkinson's disease. The dioxin material also causes birth defects, with thousands of children being born with complications as a direct result of their parents' exposure to Agent Orange. The Vietnamese government estimates that some 4 million of its people have been affected by Agent Orange, whilst other groups estimate the figure to be around 1 million. What's more, those affected are often amongst the poorest people in the country. Many of the US servicemen were told that exposure to Agent Orange was harmless. It soon became apparent when Vietnam War veterans started to link their partners' miscarriages or their children being born with birth defects with their exposure to Agent Orange in Vietnam. It was only in 1996 that the Department of Veteran Affairs acknowledged the link between Agent Orange and a number of birth defects, including spina bifida. Since the late 1970s, a number of class action lawsuits by veterans have been lodged against the companies which produced the chemical: Dow Chemical, Monsanto, and Diamond Shamrock. Whilst these companies initially rejected any link between the chemical and the plethora of medical problems, in May of 1984, 7 chemical companies settled class action lawsuits out of court mere hours before the court case began, agreeing to pay the sum of $180 million in compensation. A similar case in 2004 by the Vietnam Association for Victims of Agent Orange was brought. On the basis, the use of Agent Orange was against international law. The court and subsequent appeal determined that there was no violation of international law, as they claimed that the chemical was used to protect United States troops from ambush, and was not used as a weapon of war against human populations. The courts also held that it did not believe that the use of Agent Orange breached internationally accepted norms, citing the precedent of its use in Malaya. And even if they did, there was no intention to cause harm to humans. It was simply a secondary effect of the agent. The horrors of the Vietnam War are only ever compounded once you look a little deeper into the individual instances or weapons deployed, from the wide use of napalm to the traps of the North Vietnamese. It is easy to understand why so many involved bear the scars and trauma of the conflict. But what they could have not foreseen is that along with the trauma, they would also bring home with them a poison within their own flesh that would cause birth defects, miscarriages, and a host of illnesses. This unseen toxin has damaged thousands if not millions of lives, all for expedient deforestation. It is often difficult to end these videos, and this particular video is harder still. The pictures of those affected and the children born with disabilities as a result of their parents' exposure should act as a reminder of just how large the consequences of war can be. The Vietnam War conjures images of the cruelty of war. It is a conflict that has been widely covered by film and forms part of our popular culture. It was a war that was widely reported on, with pictures and film of the effects of war being made accessible to the world. But some aspects of the war were hidden away from public view, at least for a time. The My Lai massacre involved the murder of over 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians. Many of them were children. In today's video, we will cover the events leading up to the massacre, what happened on that day, and the aftermath. To understand the triggers of the My Lai massacre, it is important to understand the situation at the time. In January of 1968, the North Vietnamese forces launched the Tet Offensive. Prior to this offensive, it was thought that the North Vietnamese forces were all but defeated, but this was proven to be a major underestimation. 80,000 soldiers of the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong struck key military and political targets all around the country. Although the South Vietnamese and their American allies managed to defeat the attacking communists, the effect on morale was disastrous. America had already deployed troops for the 4 preceding years, with an unpopular draft forcing people into the army. Any sign that the 500,000 troops stationed in Vietnam would be withdrawing anytime soon disappeared almost overnight. In February of 1968, the United States suffered its highest death toll in a single week, over 500 dead. The Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics whittled down soldiers one by one, with the use of deadly traps, guerrilla tactics, and landmines, and these guerrilla soldiers would melt back into the jungle, often hiding amongst innocent civilians. Such was the experience of the soldiers of Charlie Company of the 11th Infantry Brigade. By March of 1968, 28 of their number were dead or wounded. This included soldiers killed by the Viet Cong snipers, by landmines, and by pitfall traps. In the same month, Charlie Company was to be deployed on a search and destroy mission in Sun My. Search and destroy was a strategy widely used in the Vietnam War, where American soldiers would be quickly deployed, usually via helicopter, to locate enemy forces and kill them. The usual warfare of taking and holding land was never going to succeed against the Viet Cong forces, so American success was measured by the body count on such missions. Prior to the attack, the soldiers of Charlie Company were briefed by their captain, Ernest Medina. Captain Medina had previously tolerated a certain level of violence from the soldiers of Charlie Company, including using civilians as a means to detect mines and personally leading violent interrogations of prisoners. It is clear from these actions that the Vietnamese civilian population were dehumanized. Medina's orders were that every person in the villages were Viet Cong or Viet Cong sympathizers, that all innocent people should not be in that area. In a bid to disrupt Viet Cong resupply, all livestock and crops were ordered to be destroyed. They were told that the area was believed to be a stronghold for the North Vietnamese forces, and to expect resistance from a hardened battalion of Viet Cong soldiers. The trouble spot was nicknamed Pinkville, due to its supposed strong communist ties. Medina phrased this operation as a way for the soldiers to gain vengeance for the men they had lost in the conflict, and to inflict heavy casualties on the Viet Cong. At around 7 AM, the soldiers of Charlie Company landed via helicopter outside of Sun My, under the command of Medina and 2nd Lieutenant William Cayley. The plan was to make their way through various villages and search and destroy any resistance. As the soldiers approached, they came across women, children, and elderly residents of My Lai. There was no sign of a hardened battalion of Viet Cong. Not a single shot was fired at the approaching American soldiers. The villagers were in the process of cooking breakfast, working in the fields, and getting ready for the day. They were not concerned when the American soldiers arrived, and they just carried on as normal. The villagers were soon rounded up and separated into groups, whilst the soldiers searched for any sign of the Viet Cong or any weapons. Homes were ransacked in the search for any evidence of the enemy forces, though in the end, they found very little evidence. In total, Only 3 old M1 Garand rifles were found, but not a single man of fighting age. Clearly there was no sign of a large Viet Cong force hiding in the village. But what was found was deemed enough, with William Cayley ordering his men to start shooting, with the order, "Take care of them." Though some soldiers initially balked at the orders, with some refusing to fire, chaos soon erupted as Cayley reissued the order to start killing civilians. Whilst some refused to take part, enough followed the orders to begin the murderous rampage. The groups of elderly men, women and children were forced into ditches and machine-gunned. At one point, Cayley interrogated a Buddhist monk as to the location of the Viet Cong. Unable to answer, he was shot and killed by Cayley. Mothers attempting to protect their children were gunned down. Their fleeing children were then targeted. According to those who witnessed the shootings, Cayley was said to have been convinced that the villagers were all booby-trapped with grenades or armed in some way. It did not matter at all that these people were holding children. Everyone was deemed to be a threat. According to Private Dennis Conti, the women of the village did all they could to protect their children. To quote him, he said, "A lot of women had thrown themselves on top of the children to protect them, and the children were alive at first. Then the children who were old enough to walk got up, and Cayley began to shoot the children." Another witness to the massacre was Michael Bernhardt. As he entered the hamlet of Zom Lang, the massacre was already underway. He said, "I walked up and saw these guys doing strange things, setting fire to the huts and waiting for the people to come out and then shooting them. As I walked in, you could see the piles of people all through the village, all over. They were gathered up into large groups. I saw them shoot an M79 grenade launcher into a group of people who were still alive, but mostly it was done with a machine gun. They were shooting women and children just like anybody else. We met no resistance, and I only saw 3 captured weapons. We had no casualties. It was just like any other Vietnamese village. Old Papa Sans, women and kids. As a matter of fact, I don't remember seeing one military-age male in the entire place, dead or alive. In one instance, Captain Medina, along with 2 other soldiers, found a young Vietnamese woman hiding in a ditch. When she emerged, hands raised, Medina shot and killed her. He would later defend his actions, as members of the Viet Cong would at times fake a surrender before revealing a pistol or grenade, and that he believed that this woman was armed. The woman was in fact unarmed, merely hiding from the American soldiers shooting up her village. In addition to the mass murder, some soldiers engaged in SAing the women and young girls. It was reported that 20 women were victims of this, some as young as 13. Once the soldiers were finished, the victims were shot. By 11 AM, approximately 500 Vietnamese civilians had been killed. Medina ordered the soldiers of Charlie Company to stop for lunch, and radioed his superiors, telling them that the mission had been a success. He reported that 100 Viet Cong had been killed, with no American soldiers dead. The only American casualty was a soldier who had shot himself in the foot by accident. One of the survivors of the massacre was Pham Thi Thuan. She and her 2 daughters, aged 3 and 5, were forced into an interrogation ditch by the soldiers. She recalls the soldiers opening fire, reloading, and firing again. They attempted to look for any survivors before firing one final time and moving on. Somehow, Thuan and her daughters were all unharmed and managed to keep quiet enough to avoid detection. They were the only survivors in the ditch, and climbed over the bodies of 170 of their neighbours. As the massacre raged below, Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson was flying a scout helicopter at low altitude, just above My Lai. He saw wounded civilians and marked their locations with smoke grenades, directing troops on the ground to assist the injured. After refueling, Thompson returned to My Lai and found the wounded villagers he had requested aid for had been killed. It was clear that these were not all combatants, as Thompson saw dead elderly men, children, and mothers with their infants. He landed near a ditch and inquired what was going on. A large group of villagers had been herded into a ditch and had been shot. Amongst the corpses, Thompson could see that there were still some alive, and so asked that the wounded be helped. The soldier he spoke to only said he was following orders, and that he would help the wounded out of their misery. As Thompson flew off, he saw the soldier firing into the ditch. He then saw soldiers moving in on a group of women and children hiding in a bunker. Realizing what was happening, Thompson landed his helicopter between the two groups. He then issued a remarkable order to his door gunner and his crew chief. Thompson was to leave the helicopter and try to speak to the American soldiers. If the soldiers were to open fire on the civilians, his helicopter crew were ordered to return fire on the rampaging US soldiers. Thompson managed to stop the soldiers from killing the civilians hiding in the bunker. The small group of villagers were then airlifted away, including a young girl who was rescued from a ditch of corpses. Thompson's constant calls for aid finally caught the attention of Lieutenant Colonel Frank Barker, who ordered Captain Medina to stop the killing. When Thompson returned to the forward base, he made his report detailing the murder of innocent civilians, but on April 24, 1968, Colonel Orrin Henderson, commander of the 11th Infantry Brigade, drafted a report that insisted only 20 civilians had been unintentionally killed at My Lai. These deaths were attributed to either the opening artillery barrage or crossfire between American and Communist forces. The report declared that Thompson's report was a fabrication. As a result, Thompson was seen as a traitor and shunned by the military. He found himself sent on ever more dangerous missions, being shot down multiple times. Throughout his life, he received many death threats. Captain Medina began the cover-up shortly after the massacre had concluded. He falsely claimed that when the soldiers of Charlie Company first entered the village, there were Viet Cong soldiers who quickly fled. When he was quizzed on the inconsistencies between the vast numbers killed and only 3 weapons found, Medina lied to the division's commander, General Costner, that the initial artillery strike had killed only 20 civilians. It is believed that Costner was not concerned greatly with his field duties, seeing a combat position as necessary to climb further up the ranks. Instead, Costner avoided the directives from the Military Assistance Command. That accusations of war crimes were to be forwarded to the Staff Judge Advocate in Saigon, and drew a line under the incident, merely reminding Medina to keep up the rules of engagement in the future. Thankfully, this was not the end of the matter. By late April of 1968, Ronald Ridenhour, a helicopter door gunner, heard rumours of what had happened at My Lai. Ronald had trained with the soldiers of Charlie Company and had started his own unofficial investigation of the massacre and began interviewing the soldiers who were there. On his return to the United States, Ronald mailed a report of his findings to the members of Congress, the Pentagon, and others in Washington. His letter sparked an official investigation into both the massacre itself and the cover-up. Ronald, Medina, Thompson, and Calley were all interviewed. In September of 1969, Cali was charged with the murder of 109 Vietnamese civilians. At Cali's trial, many soldiers who took part in the massacre did not testify, citing the Fifth Amendment on self-incrimination. Cali was initially sentenced to life imprisonment and hard labour, but following a series of appeals and political interventions, this sentence was reduced. In addition, President Nixon ordered that Cali serve his sentence under house arrest at Fort Benning. In total, Cali served 3 years. No other American soldier or officer was ever convicted for their role in the My Lai massacre. Many of them were able to rely on the Nuremberg defense of, "I was just following orders." The aftermath of the massacre was truly shocking. 504 Vietnamese civilians were dead. Of those who died, around 200 were children, with around 50 being under the age of 3. People returning to the village from the market, fields or jobs found their family members lying dead in ditches and along the roads. After the My Lai story was uncovered by the freelance journalist Seymour Hersh, the opposition to the Vietnam War only increased. No longer seeing the American soldiers as victims of a cruel war, they were now seen as its perpetrators, often called baby killers. Cali's trial was a turning point. For the first time since the war began, most of the American population believed that the war was unjust. Cali was seen as the typical American soldier in Vietnam, which resulted in once respected soldiers on their return home being shunned, tarred with the same brush. The Vietnam War continued for another 5 years, with the escalation of the war often kept secret from the American public, who had largely turned against the war. In 1998, Thompson and his crew, which consisted of Lawrence Colburn and his crew chief Glenn Andriotta, were finally recognized for the lives they saved, and they were awarded the Soldier's Medal for their acts of extraordinary bravery not involving contact with the enemy. Had Thompson not intervened, it is widely regarded that Charlie Company's rampage could have continued to the rest of the hamlets in the area, resulting in the deaths of many more innocent civilians. The My Lai massacre is perhaps the most well-known atrocity committed by the American forces in Vietnam. The subsequent attempt to cover up, combined with only Cali convicted, has led some people to believe that he was but a scapegoat for the larger failings of the military leadership. The systematic approach to covering up the massacre, with a reluctance to follow a proper procedure on reporting such massacres, were never fully accounted for. Whilst there should be no excuse for soldiers following illegal orders to massacre civilians, it is hard to separate the mental condition of the soldiers, or the type of war they were fighting, from their actions. These were ordinary soldiers, with no previous or subsequent convictions of violent offences. Yet on this day, they were capable of wholesale slaughter of innocent people. One potential explanation is that Cali was just a sadistic individual who was able to exploit the situation and his authority to commit crimes against innocent civilians for his own reasons of vengeance. That Cali was able to abuse his authority to force otherwise good men, worn down by the war, to commit such heinous crimes is another. I do not think there is an easy way to answer why the massacre happened, but any explanation cannot ignore the effects of war on the human mind and the process of dehumanization of those considered other. The lack of leadership shown by those attempting to cover up the massacre needs to be remembered, but so does the bravery of Thompson and his crew, who put themselves in the path of murderous soldiers to save the innocent people that they didn't even know. And what also deserves to be remembered is the determination of Riddenhauer and his efforts to bring the massacre and the cover-up to the public's attention. But most of all, The victims of the My Lai massacre deserve to be remembered. These people were innocent, and their deaths should never have happened. I think it's fitting to end this video with a conversation that Thompson had with a survivor that he met on the 30th anniversary of the massacre. She asked Thompson, "Why didn't the people who committed these acts come back with you so we could forgive them?" The capacity to forgive but never forget what happened is a difficult concept, but it is something that this woman was able to do. It is only through trying to understand why such horrible crimes are committed can we hope to avoid them ever happening again. During the Vietnam War, a number of ingenious, cruel, and devastating traps were employed by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. Unable to match the military capabilities of the United States, the North turned to rudimentary, effective, and utterly terrifying ways to incapacitate and kill enemy soldiers. In today's video, we will look into some of the types of traps used and the devastation they caused, and in some instances, still cause to this day. Perhaps the most infamous of the traps used is also one of the simplest. Punji sticks, that is bamboo sharpened to a point, were placed into pits. Rows of the sharp sticks were then hidden by a false floor, camouflaged to look like the jungle floor. These traps would be placed onto routes or paths where it was known that American forces would be travelling through. Upon stepping on the tarp or collection of sticks, an American soldier would fall and be impaled. Those that did not die instantly would no doubt scream in pain, alerting their enemy to their position. The injured soldier would be difficult to rescue, taking multiple soldiers out of action as they tried to help their comrade. But this is not the end of the matter. Innovations to the spike traps were varied. In some instances, human or animal waste was smeared on the punji sticks, thereby greatly increasing the chances of a serious infection for the wounded man. In other instances, the punji sticks, rather than pointing upward, would be pointed at a downward angle. This would create a situation where once a person had entered the pit, it would be almost impossible to get out without impaling oneself. Some of the spike pits were elaborate, such as pits with rotating spike-covered logs or contraptions akin to bear traps. The latter would involve two planks of spiked wood that, if stepped on, would cause the leg to fall down and the spikes to impale as the trap was sprung. It wasn't just spikes that would be found in the pits, but also venomous snakes. The bamboo pit viper was commonly used, often hundreds at a time, left for unwitting troops. A person falling into the pit would disturb the already agitated and hungry snakes, causing many to attack the unlucky soul. In fact, the bamboo pit viper became almost standard issue for the Viet Cong forces. The snakes were commonly used as a booby trap in Viet Cong's backpacks, as a mean to kill or injure those who dared to rummage through. These vipers were also used in the labyrinth network of underground tunnels used by the North Vietnamese forces, and were often tied to the walls as a form of guard. Another simple and cheap to make trap was the mace. This would be made from either a wooden or dried mud ball with a number of spikes protruding. The mace would be suspended and held in place with a tripwire. Once triggered, the gravitational force would come crashing down onto the unsuspecting soldier. A similar device was the bamboo whip. Rather than using gravity, the bamboo whip exploited the tensile strength of bamboo. On one end of the bamboo pole would be a number of sharpened spikes. The trap would be held in place by a tripwire and could be placed at varying heights. At lower levels, the spike could impale and cripple a person's legs. At higher levels, the whip would be able to pierce a person's neck or chest. The benefits of such weapons is that they could be made using only what materials were found in the jungles. More conventional weapons were also employed, though some taking a rather different shape. The grenade in a can, as it sounds, involved 2 tin cans and usually 2 grenades. The safety pins on the grenades would be removed before being put into cans, in a way that would hold down the striker lever. A tripwire was then fastened to each grenade and the device placed along paths, usually hidden in trees. When the wire was tripped, the grenades would be pulled out of the cans, causing an instant detonation. Not only would the shrapnel from the grenades be sent flying, but so too would be the metal fragments from the tins. All manner of landmines were employed by the Viet Cong. One of the simplest and perhaps hardest to detect was the cartridge trap. It was in many ways similar to the pit traps, only far smaller, making it ever harder to spot. The cartridge trap would be formed by a single round of ammunition set with a nail underneath. The nail acted as a makeshift firing pin. A board would be placed over the hole so that when stepped on would cause the victim's foot to cause the bullet to fire. In many instances, the bullet would tear through the foot, disabling the soldier. If a larger caliber of bullet was used, it could be fatal. More conventional landmines were also used, supplied from the Viet Cong allies in China and the Soviet Union. But French-made mines from the earlier First Indochina War and repurposed American mines too were used. Such mines proved devastating against American forces, with around 64,000 soldiers killed or injured by landmines during the war. The effects of landmines, however, would last long after the war. Still to this day, mines planted by all sides kill indiscriminately. Between the landmines and other unexploded ordnance, over 100,000 casualties have been recorded, with around 35,000 killed. Then there is the cost involved in removing landmines. It is relatively easy to plant a landmine. It is far more dangerous and costly to remove it. And the presence of Agent Orange residue in the soil means that uncovering the mines can sometimes result in exposure to the deadly agent. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces had little hope in fighting a more conventional war against the United States. Vastly outgunned, the communist forces utilized all manner of traps to hinder the American forces. By crippling soldiers with brutal traps, the effect on morale and the resources expended in rescuing injured soldiers was how the Viet Cong could measure success. American soldiers had to be on constant alert for traps, many of which could only be detected by careful observation. It is estimated that around 11% of all deaths and 15% of all wounds to American soldiers were caused by such booby traps and mines, meaning that tens of thousands were affected. There is little doubt that war is hell, but the traps employed by the Viet Cong resonate, perhaps due to their rudimentary build and brutal effective methods of causing casualties. Whilst the massive bombing campaigns, deployment of toxic agents, and the widespread use of napalm are associated with American attempts at victory, so too do the variety of Viet Cong traps typify the cruelty of the Vietnam War. We do have a number of videos focusing on Vietnam, such as the effects of Agent Orange, the fate of Napalm Girl, along with other massacres that occurred. Be sure to check out the channel if you wish to learn more about this war. During the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese forces and the Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, a series of attacks around the fractured country designed to cripple the South Vietnamese and their American allies. Part of the plan involved the capture of a number of cities, such as the city of Hue, with the goal of rooting out much of the South Vietnamese civilian leadership. Civil servants, priests, and foreign teachers were rounded up and detained. Once the city of Hue had been recaptured, some 2,800 bodies were found of those who had been abducted, many found bound at their hands with their heads smashed open. In today's video, we will cover the massacre that took place at the city of Hue why such a massacre took place, and what it meant for the war at large. It is perhaps helpful to start with a brief explanation of the war before the Tet Offensive. In very simple terms, the Communist North fought a guerrilla war against the American-backed South Vietnam. Before 1968, the Viet Cong operated via guerrilla tactics, striking from the shadows and from villages in the Vietnamese jungle. It was difficult for the South Vietnamese and their American allies to fully gauge the size of the Viet Cong, and it was perhaps naively believed that the Viet Cong was all but defeated. This would prove to be a grave miscalculation, as demonstrated in the Tet Offensive. Surprise attacks took place on the Vietnamese Lunar New Year festival, taking everyone by surprise as there had been an arranged truce for the festival's duration. No attack was expected on such an important holiday, meaning some cities, including Hue, had a lower number of active soldiers stationed within. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops numbering approximately 80,000 struck all over the country, targeting many military sites and attacking civilians in positions of power. In Hue, the Communist forces' key targets were the Tay Loc airfields and the Man Ca garrison, a small fortress in the old imperial city district of Hue. The attack began in the early morning of the 31st of January 1968. Key gates to the city were breached. Rockets and mortars were fired as the attack began in earnest. Although there are reports of defences mounted by the South Vietnamese, by mid-morning, the airfield was captured by the Communist forces. The Man Ca garrison, however, stood fast against the North Vietnamese, who instead went on the defensive. This, however, would allow for American and South Vietnamese reinforcements, who would prove to be vital to retaking the city of Hue. The Battle of Hue lasted until the 24th of February 1968, and would be the largest urban engagement in the Vietnam War. But during the occupation, the North Vietnamese forces were able to carry out a number of abductions, tortures, and massacres of those deemed to have no future in the North Vietnamese world. The Communist forces established their rule within Hue. Within the liberated zones, as named by the North Vietnamese, indoctrination centers were run. Food was also rationed, and youths were used for manual labor and combat. But a major drive for the Communist forces was to identify and eliminate the reactionary forces that would look to oppose their rule. Those who were deemed capable of accepting the Communist way of thinking were sent for re-education, with the view to re-employ them at a later date. For those low-level bureaucrats who had taken up arms against the North Vietnamese too were sent for re-education, though there would be no role for them within the government even following completion of the program. But for those seen to be the cruel tyrants and reactionary elements, there was to be no recourse or fixing of their mindsets. Lists were drawn up by the Viet Cong and distributed to the Communist forces, targets to be rounded up as soon as possible. Those who ended up on the lists included South Vietnamese soldiers, high-ranking civil servants, political party members, religious leaders, American teachers, and other foreigners. Many of these were identified and singled out with help from the South Vietnamese communists and revolutionaries who had fought against the South Vietnamese government, many being Hue residents able to return and play an instrumental role in rounding up the enemy. At the very top of the list for those to be executed were members of the South Vietnamese secret police. Catholic priests, too, were a key target, but the initial focus was to round up high-ranking civilian and military leadership and move them elsewhere for further interrogation. The goal was to establish a new social order that would be conducive for a communist state. It was deemed that the Catholic leaders, business owners, and others regarded as servants for American imperialism would have no place in the desired society. Many were subject to summary judgment by show trial, which would decide guilt after only a few minutes. Those found guilty would be sentenced to death for the nebulous offense of crimes against the people. There was, however, a change in approach to the undesirable elements, when it became clear that efforts to retake the city would be successful. Instead, the focus appeared to shift to the execution, not just the re-education of the reactionary elements. It would seem that the North Vietnamese forces wanted to leave no witnesses to their efforts to pacify Hue. Targets then shifted to those able to identify witnesses who would be able to point out who was responsible. It was only when the city was retaken on the 26th of February by the South Vietnamese and their American backers that evidence came to light of the massacres. By this point, much of Hue had been leveled. Around 8,000 civilians were uncalled for, and 80% of the city was damaged, with over 150,000 people left homeless. It was not until June of 1968 that some 18 mass graves were uncovered, with around 1,200 bodies. At least half of the bodies unearthed in Hue showed clear signs of murder. Many bodies were exhumed with hands tied behind their backs, with cloth stuffed into their mouths, and perhaps most horrific of all, evidence of bodies twisted in ways that indicated that they were buried alive. Many of the corpses appeared to have been executed in the same manner, with blunt force trauma to the head. It would take a few months more, but evidence of deliberate acts of murder committed by the communist forces was discovered. Reports and instructions appear to show that some 2,700 people had been declared as eliminated during the occupation of Hue. Further graves continue to be found, with hundreds more bodies dug up. Some eyewitness accounts described many individuals being led away by the Viet Cong forces, only to be found dead and buried with dozens more. German doctors Raymond Discher, Alois Alterkirchter, and Hurst Günther Kranek were found dumped in a shallow grave in a nearby field. They had all taught at a local medical school and believed themselves to be safe from any harm. A Vietnamese priest named Bu Dong, who had provided his services to both sides of the conflict and hung a photograph of Ho Chi Minh in his room, was seen being detained and dragged away by the Viet Cong. His corpse was exhumed in a shallow grave along with the bodies of 300 others. The massacre at Hue was soon used as proof of the communists' desires as to the whole of Vietnam. Following the unification of Vietnam under the North Vietnamese Communist forces, no such mass executions of the South Vietnamese or those who collaborated with American forces took place. Instead, hundreds of thousands were sent to re-education camps. In these camps, they would be subject to torture, starvation, and horrific conditions. This response confounded many in the international community, who expected such reprisals, pointing to Hue as an example of what would happen should the North be victorious. Explanations as to just what happened at Hue are not just limited to orders from the top. A book called A Viet Cong Memoir written by Trong Nhu Tang offers another explanation. Tang was a leading anti-South Vietnamese politician with ties to the Viet Cong, and his book details how he had spoken to some of his Viet Cong comrades, who, whilst admitting that civilians were massacred, insisted that those who committed the murders were young, fanatical, and ill-disciplined soldiers. They were aided by other Hue civilians who took matters into their own hands. It was put forward that some of those who died were not killed by the orders of the higher-ups, but rather a spontaneous tragedy, all too commonly seen in war. There are also controversies as to the numbers killed and as to the cause of death. Access to the mass graves was limited to only a select few in the media, and those who did not attend noted discrepancies. Some have even suggested that some of the dead were killed during the efforts to take Hue, and were buried alongside those massacred by the North, thus inflating the figures. There is, however, little doubt that the North Vietnamese forces did engage in the murder of those deemed reactionary, though there does appear to have been an effort for re-education, otherwise known as an attempt to coerce a new set of more agreeable beliefs. It would seem like this was the original aim of the Viet Cong. However, this soon developed into a situation where thousands were killed. Many historians have noted it is difficult to know for certain just how many were massacred, but very few doubt that such massacres took place. It is important to also note that many civilians would have been killed during the attempts to retake the city. According to Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci, altogether there have been 1,100 killed after liberation by South Vietnamese forces, notably students, university teachers, and priests. Intellectuals and religious people at Hue have never hidden their sympathy for the NLF. Then there are the 1,000 or so civilians who died during the attempt to retake the city, caught up in the fierce urban warfare. It is difficult to separate propaganda from truth. To this day, it is still difficult for those who lost family to the massacre in Hue to recognize their loss. Those responsible for the massacre were never punished. Nor is it even part of the story of the Vietnamese account of the war. It is simply ignored and glossed over. Yet there does exist a series of accounts from one witness to the massacre. A book called Mourning Headband for Hue offers the first-hand account. It details not only the massacre but also the experience of war by the Vietnamese civilians caught up in the mayhem. The human experience of the Vietnam War is often easily forgotten, especially true for the countless anonymous Vietnamese. For those who wish to read further about this event, it is certainly a great place to start. The massacre at Hue City was undoubtedly a politically charged event, both by anti-communist forces seeking to show the fate that would befall Vietnam should the North succeed, and by the post-war government seeking to hide the truth behind the murders. Even conservative estimates as to the death toll linger around 2,000. The Vietnam War was without a doubt a bloody conflict, a civil war and a proxy war that ravaged neighboring countries and claimed the lives of millions. Within the context of such a massive loss of life, a few thousand does not seem like such a large number, though it is vital not to forget the individual human element, especially in war where dehumanization was par for the course. What is interesting about the massacre at Hue is the lack of any real reconciliation. A sense of history is an important factor in a person's and a nation's identity. To reject it is only ever damaging.